So hello, welcome to the video and welcome to Saudi Arabia. I have wanted to come here forever and it is amazing to actually now be here. Up until very recently this was a very difficult country to visit. You could come if you had a valid business reason and you had a local to sponsor you in, but as a tourist you were limited to very expensive package tours. Now back when I had a proper job, I very nearly got here a couple of times. Indeed, I almost got a 6-month contract to come and work here, but it never actually panned out, and so this is my first visit as a tourist. Visas are expensive, but they're actually really quite easy to get these days. A relatively short visit this time, only about 3 days in total, a bit of time here in Jeddah, and then I'll be flying up to Riyadh and spending a day or so there. But it's been a fascinating experience and one that I'm really keen to share with you. And I make a point of not talking about politics in my video, but I think with this one, that's going to be tricky. So if you'd like to see what I found in Saudi Arabia, and you'd like to see how I handled a very difficult question of the politics of visiting here, stick around.
Hi, I'm Matt and this is Matt's Planet. I aim to entertain, educate and inspire with my travel adventures from planning to execution. I'll show you how you can travel in style for a lot less than you'd think. So subscribe so you can come with me. That intro was filmed on part of Jeddah's 30-kilometre long Corniche, and a very pleasant area it was too. It was early November and the temperature was still in the 90s with humidity around 50%. That's an inlet of the Red Sea, and that was a black-tipped reef shark just minding its own business. You don't expect to see a shark pretty much in the middle of a major city, and looking back, that sort of incongruity mirrored my experience of Saudi as a whole. I went with a set of expectations, few of which proved to be accurate, and I was constantly surprised by what I did find there, even if the good stuff I did find sometimes ended up not being quite as good as you hoped it would be. Example 1. That Corniche was picturesque and beautiful, yet every 100 yards or so the serenity was interrupted by a sewer outfall pipe, disgorging pretty much what you'd expect a sewer outfall pipe to disgorge, which was probably the reason that shark was lurking when I think about it. The sheer scale of the Red Sea meant that the gunk was quickly diluted, but it really wasn't a good look. Example 2. The Corniche was a pleasant place for families to congregate. I went during the day, but I believe it gets a lot more traffic in the evening. Yet these amazing prohibition notices were posted in several places. It's well worth a close read. No writing seems like a particularly stringent prohibition. I'm pretty sure that these are old and reflected the way things used to be rather than how things are today, although no one has been bothered to take the signs down, which is only going to leave the modern visitor confused about what is going on. I clearly ignored the no media photography rule. Example 3. Just around the corner on the map was Jeddah Beach. Amazing! Now, I didn't expect Benidorm or Koh Samui, Kiss Me Quick hats or a massive Weatherspoons, but I did expect some sand. There was water, rocks and ample parking, but no sand. Then to reconfound me again, I spotted a few youngsters who I would characterise as courting couples, holding hands and perhaps even engaging in a little gentle canoodling, which is something that hadn't been a feature of the Saudi Arabia I'd had in my head when I arrived. So Saudi is a place that probably isn't going to be what you expect. I flew into Jeddah, Saudi Arabia's second city, with a population of close to 4 million people. The Middle East isn't renowned for its history, but Jeddah actually does have some, in the form of an old town which dates back to the 7th century. It's atmospheric, it's spectacular, and it's certainly historic, but it's also almost completely derelict, with the majority of buildings hoarded up. A massive regeneration programme is in force as part of the Saudi Vision 2030 initiative that I'll talk about later, but right now the old town just looks great, but very few of the historic buildings are actually accessible. There's certainly lots of stray cats too, who seem to be very well looked after. I'd expected the old town to be full of cafes, which would be full of old men drinking coffee and gossiping, but there was none of that. There were a few restaurants, but they were more hole-in-the-wall style than the style that offered Western comforts. The old town, though, was full of clothing shops, street after street of them, even if the spell checker obviously had the day off when this shirt was designed. There were also a large number of mosques dotted around. It was a really nice place to experience not what you expect and not what it will be once those renovations are completed. I managed to completely miss Jeddah's other major attraction, the King Fahd Fountain, which is actually located just off that Corniche I visited. It's reportedly the tallest fountain in the world, although I think it was only operating at night when I visited. Hey, I'll just have to go back to see it. I stayed at the Mercure Hotel in Alhambra, and my experience there takes me to the next family of things I found to be a bit weird. The property had Mercure branding and the sort of corporate propaganda posters you find in Mercure hotels, but it isn't listed in the Mercure directory and their website isn't in the Mercure domain, and it just didn't feel like a Western chain hotel. Passing off is the corporate offence of pretending to be something you're not, and this may have been the most egregious example of it I've ever come across. I'd arrived off the BA flight at 6 AM and had contacted the hotel on 5 separate occasions to buy an early check-in, something their non-Mercure website said they offered. But when they finally responded, they made no reference to the early check-in policy that had been advertised on their own website and told me to just ask if a room was available when I arrived. So as instructed, I asked the desk guy if I could check in early. He sort of huffed and sighed and said that he might be able to do it in perhaps 2 hours' time, which was okay as I did rock up 7 hours before the official check-in time. So I sat in the lobby for about 15 minutes checking emails, and as I passed by the desk on the way to the exit to go and watch the sunrise, the chap called me over and said he'd found me a room, which was greatly appreciated and made the rest of the day much more pleasant as I could take a nap. But it was all a bit odd. On that occasion and on others, when the customer service person you were interacting with was pretty likely to be a Saudi citizen, you did feel you were bothering them by asking them to do something. Western standards of customer service have not yet permeated Saudi operations, or at least they hadn't in the places I visited. I'm sure you'll get a great experience in the hotels that are actually part of the chain they claim to be. So Jeddah was interesting, scenic and historic, but I'm not sure it's quite ready to accept plane loads of Western tourists. I've got nowhere near enough B-roll to cover all that I want to say, so it's talking head time. So off to Riyadh, Saudi's capital, with a population of 7 million people, which makes it bigger than Madrid and Toronto and puts it within 1 million residents of Hong Kong and Kuala Lumpur. It's a much bigger city than you expect. The total population of Saudi is around 37 million people, which is 2.5 times the population of the other rich Arabian countries of Kuwait, Qatar, Bahrain, the UAE and Oman combined. About 60% of Saudi's residents are Saudi citizens, whilst only 10% of the 10 million or so people who live in the UAE are Emiratis. So there are perhaps 4 times as many Saudi citizens as there are citizens of the other Gulf countries. And 60% of those Saudi citizens are under the age of 30. You may have the perception that every citizen of a Gulf country is rich, is related to royalty and lives a life of leisure and Lamborghinis, and in the UAE and Qatar there may be some truth to that. But that is certainly not the case in Saudi Arabia. There are millions and millions of Saudi citizens who need jobs, stimulation, fulfillment. Many of them are educated and ambitious, and many of them have an understanding of Western ways and are keen to have those opportunities and experiences themselves. But at the same time, many Saudi citizens aren't those things. I had 4 Uber drivers in Riyadh, all of whom were Saudis, versus the 4 I had in Jeddah, all of whom were Pakistanis. And I have to say, I preferred the Pakistanis because they did seem to have some understanding of how to drive. But regardless of their potential, no Saudi youngster these days is going to be satisfied living the life that their parents or grandparents experienced. And even with Saudi's vast oil wealth, the state could not hope to support all of these millions and millions of people, especially as both the demand and supply for fossil fuels is going to decline over the next decades. So it's time to dive into some controversial subjects. Mohammed bin Salman Al Saud, or MBS as he's known, became Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia in 2017. If you're not familiar with that title, it means he's the heir apparent. And as his father, the current king, is elderly and frail, he has progressively assumed many of the responsibilities of the monarchy whilst his father is still alive. Basically, he's the boss. And he has embarked on an aggressive campaign of modernisation. He recognised that the Saudi population needed change, and in the space of less than a decade he has delivered nothing short of a revolution. One of the first things he did was to curtail the powers of the religious police, a group tasked with enforcing Islamic law, something they often did with excessive gusto. The relaxation of the restrictions on what women can do in society flows from that, as does the astonishing regeneration programme Saudi Arabia is currently experiencing, the Saudi 2030 vision I mentioned earlier. I heard people describe MBS as Saudi's Lee Kuan Yew, the man who led Singapore for decades and turned the country into an economic powerhouse. But Lee Kuan Yew was an authoritarian leader who limited the freedom of the press and clamped down on any political opposition. His government was also accused of significant human rights abuses. Yet history smiles on his achievements. And MBS is also an authoritarian leader. And history, and the Western media, is quite rightly focusing on that side of him, rather than on the progressive changes he is making to Saudi society. Some of the things that have been done in his name are outrageous, need to be condemned, and cannot be forgotten. But as people on the ground told me, Saudi Arabia today is unrecognisable compared to the country that existed when he took power. And that's happened in less than a decade, and that is down to MBS. My video about Saudia, the state-owned airline, elicited a handful of comments along the lines of how could you support a state that persecutes women and gays? Only a handful of comments though, and I think I expected more, but let's just wait and see the response to this video. But let's hit all of that head on and start with women. The restriction of the powers of the religious police meant that for the first time Saudi women were not forced to wear the hijab. That's the Muslim head covering. I rarely saw a woman wearing the niqab, which is the full face covering. I regularly saw women without any sort of headscarf at all. And I regularly saw women with their abayas unfastened. That's the full-length black outer garment. By leaving them open, it allowed them to show off the fashions they were wearing underneath. I don't remember ever seeing that in the UAE or Qatar, both places I've spent some time. And it led me to believe that perhaps Saudi was actually a little more liberal than its neighbours now. Women are by no means equal in Saudi society, but I'll pop a link in the description below to a list of reforms that have been enacted during MBS's tenure. And they clearly communicate the direction Saudi is moving in. A single female traveller will still find it strange to travel through the kingdom, but they can, and they will be safe. And it would certainly be an experience to travel that way. So let's move on to gay visitors. Now I've occasionally poked fun at Non-Stop Dan, but he and his partner Oscar have visited the kingdom on a number of occasions and made videos about those experiences. Their testimony on this issue will carry far more weight than mine, but their videos support what people told me on the ground. And that is that in Saudi Arabia in 2024, no one really cares what you get up to behind closed doors. In public, discretion is still advised, but as long as you are respectful of local customers, there's really no issue with being gay in Saudi Arabia. And everyone should always be respectful of local customs when travelling, gay or not. It is obviously outrageous for homosexual relations to be illegal in Saudi Arabia. But it may surprise you to learn that same-sex sexual relations were only legalised in Scotland in 1981, which is well into my lifetime. You may also be surprised to learn that male same-sex sexual relations are still illegal in Jamaica, St Lucia, Samoa and Tonga, and Malaysia and Sri Lanka, none of which face calls for tourism boycotts. People not caring what people do in private extends beyond same-sex relationships. VPNs easily allow people to access all of the internet, and people really don't care. Black market alcohol seems to be readily available, and people really didn't care. Non-Muslim clergy are free to visit the kingdom these days to administer to their communities. And as long as worship is conducted in private, no one really cares. This is clearly a long way from the freedoms that you enjoy in the West, but it is an equally long way from where Saudi Arabia was just 8 short years ago. And again, my sense was that in some ways, in 2024, Saudi Arabia may be more liberal than some of its Gulf neighbours. A quick final point about travelling to Saudi Arabia. I will never be critical of anyone whose ethics and morality leaves them unwilling to visit a specific country. That's your choice. And plenty of people will still be uncomfortable about visiting Saudi Arabia, regardless of what I say. But I visited the place, and I came away with a radically different opinion of it than I'd had when I'd got on the plane at Heathrow. And that perception is mine. It doesn't come from a video, from the media, or from talking to a friend. It comes from going and seeing the place for myself. Governments and what they do are what make the news. But it's the people you meet that actually makes a place. And often those people are as negative about their governments as the foreign media are. But you'll only find that out by travelling and talking to people yourself. Yet this was a very strange occasion where people were welcoming, they were friendly, they were happy to talk. But they also love what MBS is doing, what he has done, and where Saudi Arabia is going. So back to Riyadh, and I stayed at a locally owned and branded hotel, the Dara. Quite a hip and trendy design. You can see what they're trying to achieve here. It wasn't a cheap night to be staying in Riyadh for some reason, but 120 quid got me a suite, which I can't say I was expecting, but I certainly enjoyed the space. I'd never before seen this cute way of communicating with the room attendants. Hey, there was even a pool. It wasn't in a brilliant location, but Riyadh is a city where you get around by taxi anyway. One tip when staying in Saudi is that it's probably worth checking a map to see if your hotel is right next door to a mosque, as the pre-dawn call to prayer may wake you up. This one did. Riyadh is a bit of a building site at the moment. You may be familiar with Emaar, which is one of the UAE's biggest and best known property development companies. Well, Roshan is the Saudi equivalent, and it has more building projects underway in Saudi today than Emaar has completed in the UAE in the last 20 years. That is an astonishing statistic, and the scale of the construction work going on in Riyadh is equally astonishing. Much of what is being built is tourist focused, including theme parks, sporting areas and massive resorts. They're even constructing the world's largest building in downtown Riyadh. One attraction that is open now is the Diriyah. This is the site where Saudi Arabia was founded, and again is atypically old for an Arabian attraction, dating back to the 15th century. Because of the heat, it's been designed to be most effective as a nighttime destination, and it really does look spectacular. There's even a light show played out on some of the walls. Below the city are a number of restaurants, and it was a popular place on a Wednesday night. First time I've ever had coffee served in a teapot. For a small fee you can wander through the ruins, and they're very atmospheric and really quite interesting. I only had 24 hours in Riyadh, and in some ways that was probably enough. So much is promised, but relatively little is available now. The opening hours of the Skywalk in the Kingdom Centre meant I couldn't visit on this occasion. But in just a couple of years, I fully expect Riyadh to be competing with Dubai to be the place to go in the Middle East. And I would not be at all shocked to learn that alcohol will be available in hotels in the same way as it is in Dubai. To wrap all of this up, I've used the word odd in this video on multiple occasions, but here's 6 more things I found odd about the kingdom. They still use ring pools. I can't think how many years it's been since these were scrapped in the UK. It was a real flashback. Saudis love their tissues. Pretty much every seat in a public space comes equipped with a box, which is a bit odd, as I believe blowing your nose in public is considered rude. They really were everywhere. Very, very few Saudis seem to smoke. I only saw 2 people smoking the whole time I was there. I believe only about 10% of Saudis smoke anyway, and there are very, very few places where you can smoke, but I was surprised at how limited it was. Islamic countries often have high smoking rates because it's one of the few vices allowed by Islamic law, but not in Saudi. I only saw 3, perhaps 4 ATMs the whole time I was there, and I only came across 1 money changer. Most Saudis just use their phone to pay for things. I got some cash out of the first ATM I came across because I thought I'd need it, but I really shouldn't have bothered. It's the opposite of a cash society. I think I was the only person I saw using cash, and I was only doing so because I had to get through the stuff I'd got out of that ATM. Be prepared. Labour is abundant, so if you go anywhere touristy, every barrier, every ticket machine, every door will have an attendant. It's really quite annoying. At the Diriyah in Riyadh, every traffic light also had an attendant, many of which wanted you to ignore the lights and do what they wanted you to do instead, which actually felt really dangerous, particularly as you could barely see the attendant because you were dazzled by the enormous traffic light just above them. And finally, there are no urinals in Saudi Arabia. There are also no urinals. I saw some in Jeddah airport, but none in the cities. I can only assume that getting your yoo-hoo out for a wee was offensive to public morals. So toilet time is all about the cubicle. But as the preferred method to clean up aisle 1 is the hose pipe, the floors of those cubicles were always soaking wet, which was quite disgusting. But labour is abundant, as I said, so in every toilet I visited there were attendants ready to nip into each cubicle between users to give it a bit of a mop. But you couldn't tell whether they were actually cleaning the floors or just moving everything around. It really wasn't very pleasant. So Saudi Arabia is an amazing place and I really enjoyed my visit. It's not going to be for everyone and it's not ready for all of you to arrive en masse. But it will be, and it will be soon. If you're the sort of person who likes to go to a place before everybody else does, go soon. And even if you're not, there's an argument for going so that you can see the place now to contrast it with what it's going to be like in just a few years' time. And there is no substitute for going and seeing a place for yourself rather than relying on the perception that you might build from viewing Western media. This has been an extremely difficult video to make. It's a bit of a diversion from my usual content and I'm sure not everybody's going to like it. But I hope I've explained and contextualised the experience that I had. I'll put links to quite a lot of resources that I've referred to in the description of this video, but thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. Please give the video a like if you did and leave me a comment. I think some people won't be shy to, but I would love to hear from everyone regardless of what preconceptions you may have had before watching this video. Please consider subscribing if you're new, and I have a Patreon account if you don't hate me and would perhaps like to support what I'm doing. So thanks again for watching. I'll see you all in the next one. Goodbye.